My grandpa Totty came out from England when he was 2 years old with his family. Two brothers came out, Thomas and John Totty. Thomas went to the North Island with his family and settled there, and John came to the South Island and settled in Ashburton with his family. And so far as we know, they are the only Totties in New Zealand. They came from Yorkshire, where they were a farming family, a place called Ragby, which is near Wakefield, and the farm was called Hilltop Farm. John married Teresa Nicholson, and she came from Barnsley. They had the two boys in England, and then when they arrived in Ashburton afterwards, two daughters were born to them. John Totty had a livery stables where he hired out horses and gigs to people like doctors who needed to visit people in their homes, and sometimes he would drive them there if they needed to be driven. He was apparently a very good judge of stock, and he was a great horseman, and he was one of those very fussy people who keep their gear, their harness and everything beautifully tidy and clean and polished and everything in its place. And my father, as a young boy, I think he sometimes fell foul of Grandpa John, who was very particular. His brother referred to him as Gentleman John, and that was how he was kind of known in the family. My Auntie Isabel, who stayed with them some of the time when she was at school, she said everything was beautifully kept around their lawn and their gardens, and everything was very groomed and so on. My grandpa, Charlie, he was destined to be a doctor, but he had terribly bad eyesight. He had to wear very thick glasses, and apparently even from when he was in Standard 5, which now would be, well, was Form 1, but he had really bad cataracts, and so there was no way that he could train to be a doctor with his bad eyesight. So he trained as a cabinet maker. I think he must have done more than that too, because he actually built the house that their first home where he and Grandma lived. And Grandpa met and married Isabella Dallas. She had done a dressmaking course in Dunedin. I'm not sure why she went to Ashburton, but somehow she managed to get there, and she and Grandpa met, and they married and they settled in Ashburton. Grandpa's sister, Effie, married a man who was a violinist and gave concerts around the country, and she accompanied him, so they travelled quite a lot. And a very interesting photo of her. She looks a really interesting sort of person. Grandma's family settled on at least her grandparents settled on the Otago Peninsula. They built a really beautiful stone house there eventually, and they were instrumental in starting the first cheese factory in New Zealand. And today even there's a plaque on the road outside the driveway to that house, just commemorating the cheese factory. Apparently the grandmother was a very good cheesemaker herself, and then gradually the dairy farmers around got the idea of joining together and forming a co-op, and so the first cheese factory was started. They were the Mathesons, John and Catherine Matheson, and they came out on I think it was the Jura, the ship they came out from Scotland on. And their daughter Jessie married Charles Dallas and went to live down at Te Hauka, just south of Balclutha. Grandma was one of 4 or 5 children. Apparently one of the highlights of their year was going by horse and gig to just near Kaka Point, Port Molyneux, where they had Highland Games once a year, and it was a big highlight of their year. My great auntie Daisy was telling me about that when I boarded with her. Grandma and Grandpa lived in Ashburton for a time, and Grandpa had a little bit of land where he kept some dairy cattle, and then he decided he would go farming. And they moved to Clandeboye, where they bought a farm for a period of time, but they didn't like it there. They didn't like the climate, and I think perhaps the land was difficult, and so they bought land at Staveley. The place was called Lawn Hayes, which it still is called, and they moved their family there. Grandma and Grandpa had 4 children. Dad was the eldest, and there was Isabel, Ainsley, and Uncle Jack, who was 12 years younger than Dad. They added extra land to the farm as time went on, so it increased in size quite a bit. And it was in those days the farmers helped each other when it came to haymaking time and I guess certain sheep work, and they would all pitch in and help. Dad helped on the farm from the time he was just a young boy, of 8 or 9 years old, and because Grandpa's sight was so bad, a lot fell to Dad. I think he even was involved in helping to plan what they were doing as he got older, but he used to help milk the cows before he went to school. They went to Springburn School and travelled in a horse and gig, and Auntie Isabel said that there was a little paddock beside the school where the horses were kept, and there was always a great rush to get out of the gate because the last one out had to close the gate, so everybody sort of hurried like mad to get their horse and gig out in time. Somewhere around about that time, Dad caught the Spanish flu, and he was actually very ill, and Auntie Isabel had to take time out of school to do the things that Dad normally did, like helping to milk the cows and various jobs around the farm. But he did recover, but apparently he had it quite badly. And then there was the polio epidemic, and apparently schoolwork was sent home and their mother supervised their lessons. Dad had about 2 terms at a high school, I think, and then calving was coming up and Grandpa needed a help, and he ended up never going back to school. So, but he educated himself in other ways. I don't think he ever lacked too much from not having that time. Auntie Isabel went on to become a school teacher. Her sister Ainsley stayed at home and helped on the farm. And Jack, of course, was a lot younger. He eventually went into the Air Force when the war was on. I think he was only about 13 or 14. Yes, he had a very, very brief, what with the polio thing as well, as being needed at home. It was a very short high school education. He certainly learnt to work very hard, even just as a young boy. And apparently when Grandma was having Uncle Jack, they were putting electricity into the cowshed, and Grandpa felt he couldn't get away, and so it ended up with Dad having to drive his mother over to Methven to have this baby. And I heard that Grandma was not very happy going over the Black Bridge, which was on the way. It's very rough and bumpy, and I sort of felt it was a really big thing for a 12-year-old boy having to drive his mother about, I don't know how many k's it is over there, but it takes about 20 minutes in a car, so it would take a great deal longer in a horse and gig. Another story about the Black Bridge was Grandpa bought a cow in Methven, and so he drove over it with his horse and gig to bring this cow home, and he tied the cow on behind the gig. And they got to this Black Bridge, and in the middle of the bridge the cow decided to sit down, and there was no way he could get it to get back up again. And there were other people trying to get onto the bridge and couldn't because it was blocked. And in the finish, in desperation, Grandpa just towed the cow across the rest of the bridge, and then it got up on its feet and walked the rest of the way home without any trouble. Dad had a very lovely, very true soprano voice as a boy, and he did have singing lessons, and he was actually chosen to go in the Christchurch Cathedral choir, but because he was needed at home on the farm, it never happened. But he loved singing, and he always sang, and even when his voice broke, he still had a very nice tenor voice. And one of the favourite occupations when we were growing up was evenings around the piano, especially at the weekend. We'd sing all Dad's old songs, and he played the mouth organ a bit, and we had a Swanee whistle, and Ian would try and play that. And yeah, we really enjoyed music, and if we had people around, quite often it would turn into a musical evening and people would contribute. And Grandma had her little Scottish poem that she shared called I can't say it properly, but yes, they would persuade her, and eventually she would say it for us. I think Alan's got a recording somewhere of one of those evenings with everybody doing their bit. And Ian used to say afterwards to his children, he said, I'd rather be at home at one of those musical evenings than going out with my mates doing something else. And they, of course, couldn't believe that. They thought it was a very, very strange way to be. The farm had really good soil, but it was terribly stony, and many, many hours was spent picking stones off the paddocks and carting them to a big stone heap, usually in the middle of the paddock somewhere. And as kids we used to be employed doing that. We got a penny for 12 stones, and I one Christmas had allowed mine to accumulate, and Dad gave me 4 guineas, which I went and spent on my Oxford Companion to Music, which I've used ever since. So it was really money well invested. There was a strong community spirit in the district, and they made their own entertainment. They had team games and concerts and dances. And to go back a bit, when Dad was a young man, he was in what they called the Mid-Canterbury Yeomanry Cavalry, and very much involved horses and competitions. And I have this lovely photo of a team of 4 going over a jump together in sync. He was a good horseman, and so was Grandpa. They all inherited that love of horses, and Grandpa's father, I think, used to be part of the hunt. I have a photo of a whole group of people with their pink jackets on. I don't know what they chased, whether it was a hare or what, but we don't have foxes, so it can't have been a fox. Before he was married, Dad and all the young men in the district that lived on dairy farms used to have races with their horse and cart and their cream cans on the back, trying to see who got down to the dairy factory first. And my Uncle George wrote a book called Bush, Boulders and Bullocks, and there's a description of them. He said there's young Ed Totty in the lead and racing down the road to Staveley where the dairy factory was, and it was a cream that they were taking. And Dad had a reputation for working late at night, and apparently the drafter was going home after midnight one night, and here was Dad still crutching lambs by, I don't know if it was moonlight or whether he did have a shed. I presume they had the wool shed at that stage. But yes, he was also known to be cutting gorse hedges at night by moonlight, so I've heard. And Dad had what he called a goss knife. He didn't call it a gorse knife, but it was a goss knife, which I suspect is a Scottish, perhaps, expression. just a long knife with a blade on the end. Dad met Mum through Auntie Isabel. They were friends at high school, and I think she went up and stayed at the farm one time with Isabel, and they were probably around 16 or so at the time. And then Dad thought he would go down and visit Mum in Ashburton, but Grandma wasn't having any of it. This was Grandma Yeoman. She wouldn't allow him inside, and she sort of sent him on his way from the sound of it, and so they didn't meet up again until they were in their late 20s. Mum was 28 when they finally got married, and Dad was 30. They might have got married a lot sooner had they been allowed to be friends when they were young, but Grandma was quite stern and strict in that respect. And Mum and Dad lived in what is now known as the sharemilker's house, and we lived there for the first 10 years. And then there was a big change around. Grandma and Grandpa moved out of the homestead and into the cottage where Auntie Sylv and Uncle Jack had been living, and they moved onto their own farm, and we moved into the homestead. And Lynn was born just around that time. She was just a baby. Mum took us over to Methven once a week to have piano lessons, and Mr. Hope from Ashburton came down on the bus and took pupils in Methven one day a week. So the first three of us had a chance to learn the piano. The girls tended to carry on longer than the boys. Everybody did have a chance eventually. Lynn and Alan were younger. We went to Bushside School, which was just about a mile or so down the road. It was just a one-teacher school. In all my primary schooling, I had 3 teachers over that time, and only one other person in my class. It was Arthur Pawsey, and we went through school together. Only at one stage did a family move into the district, and they had 3 girls, and I had a girl my own age, the only sort of girlfriend I ever had at school. And then they moved away again, but I wrote to that girl for long afterwards. I can still see her writing. It was nice getting letters in the mail. But our main young company was our cousins, the Rountrees. They used to come over regularly, and we got on really well with them and had a great time together. I think they look back on it quite fondly. They'd come over to visit Grandma and Grandpa when they were living in the cottage, and yes, we always had a good time together, and we went over to stay with them sometimes and vice versa. We loved summer on the farm. We'd go out helping bring in hay, and especially at night there's the beautiful smell of the new mown hay, and Mum used to pack picnic teas, they were, and a particular part of the farm was separated from the rest of it. It was called Fagans, and there were lovely poplar trees, and we'd sit under the poplar trees and have our picnic tea, and then we would help Dad load the round bales, they were, onto the truck and drive them home to the hay shed and ride on the hay. And that was one of the really nice times. I didn't ever milk cows back then, and that came later. I went to Ashburton High, and at the start, for the first 2 years, I had to go down on the bus every morning. We were always late for school, half an hour late, because the bus went a very roundabout way. It took an hour and a half from Staveley to Ashburton. And then we missed the last half hour of school, which was mainly sports, I think, going home at night. I read a vast quantity of books on that bus. The second 2 years, my last 2 years at high school, I stayed with Grandma and Grandpa Yeoman down in Ashburton and just came home at weekends. Mum used to come down every Friday night, and picked me up, and I learnt to drive largely on driving home from Ashburton. And then I went to Teachers College in Dunedin. Everybody south of the Rakaia River was sent to Dunedin. Everyone north of it went to Christchurch College. And there we had to, for the first term, we had to sit in alphabetical order. And I was sitting next to Christine Todd, who became a good friend, and I used to go down and stay with her from time to time. Even after she decided she didn't want to be a teacher, but we stayed in touch. I went down every so often to Owaka, which I'd never heard of before, and I met Gordon at Christine's 21st birthday party. But we didn't really get to know each other that night, but I did think he was rather nice, and Christine invited me back down the following Christmas holidays, and so I went down there, and that's where I really got to know him. And that's about as far as I've got with the Totties. Adam Paterson, Gordon's great-grandfather, yes, that's right, Gordon's great-grandfather was born in Moneymusk in Aberdeenshire in Scotland, and when we went over there, we went to Moneymusk, got some photos of there. He was what they call a journeyman shoemaker, and apparently the word journeyman means that you've done your training. You can have a journeyman gardener, for example, and that means that you're a qualified person and whatever. In the old shed there was this dear little shoe last for a little child. Do you remember that? Did you ever see it? I think it could be somewhere in my garage. I'm hoping it is. He married Mary Ann Marshall, who worked in a paper mill, and their first child, Adam, died at 1 year old. And then they had Robert and Jane, who died at 3 years old, and then Helen, Adam, who was known as Addie, and Mary Ann, who was Auntie Annie. You won't remember her, but when we were first married, Auntie Annie lived down the road with Gladys, who was her daughter, in that little house by the river, you remember? And Edward, who was Ted. So they emigrated to New Zealand in 1869 and landed at Port Chalmers, and the ship was called the Invercargill. They settled in Owaka in 1870. A small, it's called a service station, was set up at the landing halfway down to Punawea, between Owaka and Punawea. Adam was the first butcher in the area, and there was another man, a meader, who was a baker, and the pair of them supplied the mill workers and the settlers with bread and meat and groceries. And Adam was also the wharf clerk for the ships that came up the river. Quite big ships could come up back then because the channel in the river was much deeper than it is now. I think it was quite busy. And also just along the road at the Blue Gums was is it William McPhee, who built ships? Not sure what relation he is. Mike McPhee wrote a book about all the ships that his forebear had built and their histories, and he also had pictures of them in the book, it's really quite interesting. In 1888, Adam took over the licence of the Catlins River Hotel, which had been burnt down, and he built a new hotel, the landing, or just along from the landing, and that kind of hollow just along. He also ran a coach service to the railhead. The rail came successively closer to Owaka. First of all, he had to go to Romahapa, and then it came to Glenormuru, and then the tunnel, and Tahora, and finally to Owaka, where they built a station as well. He was quite an enterprising man. He also built the first hall in Awaka, and it was known as Paterson's Hall. Prohibition came in 1894, and so he closed the bar and opened up a general store and renamed the hotel the Temperance Hotel. That was what it was known as. He bought land from Captain Catlin's estate, and Captain Catlin's had bought it from the Maoris, and Captain Catlin's thought he was buying a lot more land than he actually ended up with. It was the piece of land he got was 93.3 hectares, and he thought he had a vast amount more than that and was rather disgusted, I think. Adam died in 1932, and his son Addie, who was Gordon's grandfather, did quite a lot of work on the farm, and then he moved to Awaka, where he opened a general store, and it also has baker on the, so I don't know if he actually did the baking or whether somebody did it for him, but he had this quite good sized shop on the main street of Awaka, and we still have his big ledgers with beautiful copper plate writing, and everybody must have paid once a month, and so the name of the person was at the top of the ledger, and then the amounts that they owed were down on the page. In the early days, he helped with Eddie, this is a young man, helped to drive his father's coach as well. Then obviously they went to live in Awaka. I think they may have lived on the farm for a time, but then they moved to Awaka, and they had 4 children, Ernest and Clara and Charlie and Olive, and Charlie of course was Gordon's dad. Addie married Alice Maud Mary Leach Bird, which is an amazing name, and her father was the foreman for the brick building when they were building the tunnel in Tunnel Hill. And if you ever look inside the tunnel, the brickwork is quite beautiful, and quite a lot of people, they have it like a wee tourist attraction now, and people go and walk through the tunnel and admire the brickwork. I've got his obituary, a copy of it, and he was a very highly respected and liked man. He was a JP, and he also had the job of managing secretary of the dairy company that was formed in Awaka. That was a butter, they produced butter with the Canoe brand on it, and Gordon worked there as a boy probably in his teens, in his holidays, worked at the dairy factory and really enjoyed it. But yeah, so his grandfather was one of the men who were instrumental in setting the dairy company up. And he also had the Spanish flu and ended up with only half a lung, so he wasn't able to do, heavy work any longer, but that was a good job for him. He was another of these very tidy people. His granddaughter Gwenda was telling me how he split the kindling ready to light fires, and he did them up, and they were all the same length, and he did them up in neat little bundles, and they were all placed on the shelf in the shed and all ready to use, and everything was kept very, very tidily. Gwenda was very fond of her granddad. She said he was a lovely man. Charlie, when as a young man, worked for a time in the timber mills. We've got a photo of him with 4 others at the mill. He's the one sitting down on a log, and the others are standing beside him. And we got that photo blown up because it was such a good one of him. And your cousin Mark looks a spitting image of him. So interesting. He also worked up Central for a time, And then his sister Clara was working in Ashburton with a certain Ned Wiley, and Charlie went up to visit his sister in Ashburton one Easter, and he met Ned, and it must have been love at first sight, I think, because by the time he came away, a few days later, they were practically engaged. She was quite a character, was Ned. She'd been engaged 3 times and broken it off herself each time. But this time it was for real. When Net's family came out from Scotland, there were 3 girls and 3 boys in that family, and they were a mining family. But when they came out here, they lived at Denniston on the west coast, and Gordon's cousin Jack said, I think, he became a home missioner, so he travelled around speaking in churches and so on. But when they lived in Denniston, Jack said, I think he was meant to convert the miners, which might have been quite an undertaking, I suspect. And I think while they were there, Ned got appendicitis and was rushed down. You've been to Denniston, haven't you? Yes, so it's not the easiest place to get out of. Rushed down to hospital, and I'm not sure if it was Reefton or which of those west coast towns. Oh, yes, I was going to say about Uncle Bob, Gordon's Uncle Bob, this is. One of the 3 boys was in an accident in a coal mine over on the west coast. He was hurt, he survived, but from then on he had epilepsy, and he didn't ever do mining again, and I don't know that he was able to work terribly well either. He lived with Auntie Meg, who was his sister, in Dunedin, in South Dunedin. They lived on 33 Reed Road. I've always remembered that address. Gordon took me there when we got engaged, and to meet Auntie Meg and Uncle Bob. And the other 2 brothers were the ones that went scheelite mining up at Glenorchy. Yeah, they did very well for a time when scheelite was worth a lot of money. And they sent their sons to boarding school in Dunedin, and they would hire a small plane, to take tuck boxes to the boys at boarding school, which was thought to be a great extravagance by some other members of the family. I met Gordon, as I said, at Christine's 21st. We ended up sitting on a sofa next to each other and really only exchanged a few words at the end of the evening, and then I came back to stay with Christine again in the holidays, and we walked from Awaka down to Punawea, and there was a sort of like an outdoor service in the evening. Perhaps it was a Sunday, I can't remember. And we met him again down there, and then we arranged to go floundering. So I think there was about 6 of us in the boat, and we went floundering this night and with lights, and it was really quite fun. And so that was our first kind of date. And then we went up to Margaret and David's one evening and played games like Pit, which was extremely rowdy and a lot of fun, especially with Margaret being there. She was a very good games player. Then he took me home I was staying with the Todds. I'm not too sure what else we did there. I was there for about a week, I think. And then we arranged to write to each other, and I wondered, when I got home, I was wondering whether he would or not. And then this letter came in the mail with this little scrawly writing. You know what his writing was like. Yeah, and anyway, we had this correspondence, and he came up to stay that Easter. So he came up in Uncle Adam's little Humber car, because he didn't have a car at that stage, so he had to borrow Adam's car. Yes, the next year we corresponded and went back and forth occasionally, and the following Christmas holidays, I got myself a job as a nurse aide in the Waka Hospital. It was a proper hospital at that stage, and my great aunt Georgina, Aunt Georgina Dallas, Tom's mum, was the matron of the hospital. And so I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, which was a shock. And the first job I was given was to bath an old lady, and I didn't know where to start. It was a bit of a shock, but it was a nice chance to. I was living in the nurses' home, but we managed to see quite a bit of each other, and it was really nice. And then we got married the following April 1964, and you were born in 1965. And Glyn came down to stay, and actually meant to have another look at this. She after Gordon died, she wrote this beautiful book for me, and it was full of poems and readings, and she described her visit when she came to stay to our little house, and she just absolutely loved it, because when Gordon went to pick her up from the bus, I think, and she came in and the fire was lit, and it just was all very cosy, and and I was expecting you, and Gordon used to refer to you as Jock, and he was inquiring how Jock was. And Glyn wrote this lovely description in this book. It was a big change of lifestyle for me. I thought afterwards, really, I didn't have enough to do. It was just a little wee house. And I read copious amounts of books, but I wrote home to Mum and said, can you send me some sewing to do? Can I make Lynn some dresses? Something like that, just to have something to do. I thought afterwards I should have been put in a farmhouse, cooking for farm workers and all the rest of it, that I would have been really used to, but, Gordon's parents were still on the farm, so, that all happened up there. And we were down the road, and he was milking the cows with his father morning and night, and raising pigs. That was how we were to make our income, was from the pigs, which he took over from Adam. He'd been doing that previously, and after we got married, Adam decided to go off and explore the North Island and work up there for a time, which he did until he and Glyn got married, and then Grandad helped them into the farm at Gallagher. Gordon helped his father on the farm, but he raised pigs and took them to market in Dunedin. And first we had Adam's old truck, old Ford I think it was, and then eventually we bought an international truck, which cost us far too much, and it took a while to pay off, but it was mainly for taking the pigs to town. But it was also our only, before that we had the little Hillman Imp when we first got married. Yes, he used the trucks for taking the pigs to town, but we had to sell the Hillman Imp to buy the big truck. I can remember driving down Spinks's Hill with you and Claire, sitting on the seat, no seat belts or anything like that, and you were standing up, and somebody in front of us sort of stopped, and I had to stop in a hurry, and I remember putting my arm out to hold you from, you did bang your head on the dashboard, but not too badly. And so we lived in the little house until you were 8, Al was 3, and Claire was 6, I guess. Grandma and Granddad decided to retire, so we swapped houses, but their intention was always to go and live in Oamaru. They'd actually gone as far as buying a house there, and then that January Granddad had the stroke and ended up in hospital and was there for the next 10 or so years, I think. It was a long, long time. Really, really hard for him. I did miss them, and I missed the mountains very much. I was really grateful to Auntie Sylv and Uncle Jack for giving us that photo of Mount Somers as a wedding present, which is still hanging in my bedroom. And it was strange going somewhere where you hardly knew anybody. I'd tell you one thing, that it's really important to call people by their names. Dear Mrs. Burney, someone must have told her who I was, and she would always greet me down the street and call me Alison, and it just made a difference. But we had Margaret and David, and we got to know the other young people, and there were a lot of young marrieds in the church at that time, and it was really nice. They had a sort of monthly get together for quite a while. It was Rosemary and Bill Keelty and quite a few of them, which was really nice.